In a victory for investigative journalism, but a decidedly bad moment for science, the Lancet had to retract that super fraudulent paper that we've been focusing on. And as well, there is another good study that came out about hydroxychloroquine that says maybe not so effective at preventing people from catching COVID who've been exposed. Hello, everyone. Dr. Chris Martinson here with your update for June 4th, 2020, day 133, titling this one Fraud and Deceit, but also good science. Remember, we're here for the science, and that's what we care about. So I had a number of people say, excuse me, that your hydroxychloroquine failed a trial. And I'm like, no, what? Back up. I'm here supporting science. I'm here supporting good science. I'm here supporting logical conclusions. I'm here supporting the things that make good logical sense. So let's get right into it, and we'll talk about this. Well, this is the Lancet retraction that we knew was coming. Let's check this out. So this was the paper that made this really huge splash, hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine with or without a macrolide for treatment of COVID-19. And this is the one that actually said, wow, this stuff is super dangerous. It creates all sorts of heart conditions and more deadly than, not taking anything at all. And this is the one where there was a gentleman out of a company called Surgisphere, which I've been calling Surgifraud, Sapan Desai. He was just making data up, of course. So let's check this out. They wrote here, after publication of our Lancet article, several concerns were raised with respect to the veracity of the data and analyses conducted by Surgisphere Corporation and its founder and our co-author, Sapan Desai, in our publication. We launched an independent third-party peer review of Surgisphere with the consent of Sapan Desai to evaluate the origination of the database elements, to confirm the completeness of the database, and to replicate the analyses presented in the paper. Our independent peer reviewers informed us that Surgisphere would not transfer the full dataset, client contracts, and the full ISO audit report to their servers for analysis, as such transfer would violate client agreements and confidentiality requirements. As such, our reviewers were not able to conduct an independent and private peer review and therefore notified us of their withdrawal from the peer review process. We're out of here. We're bailing. Peace out. Good luck with your stuff there. So guess what? They had to just retract the paper because, surprise, surprise, there was no real data there. Sapan Desai had nothing to actually transfer. And by the way, The Guardian went further and called up enough hospitals in Australia who would have provided even the limited data set that he claimed to have after they removed the so-called Asian hospital from the data set that they blah, blah, blah. They were just scrambling like fraud scamsters do. When they're trying to cover their last tracks. But at any rate, The Guardian called enough hospitals to ascertain that none of them had even heard of Surgisphere, let alone had any sort of agreement with them. This was just absolute crap of a study. And everybody involved ought to have known this. This is a huge black eye for Brigham and Women's Hospital. This is a huge, that's out of Harvard there. This is a huge black eye here for University Hospital of Zurich. It's a huge black eye here for Utah, University of Utah there at Salt Lake City. And unfortunately, this rang a bell, that Salt Lake City piece. I'm going to have to retract something further in just a second because that suddenly reminded me of something and I had to look into it. And we've had further trouble with all of this. So Sapan Desai running a fraud. Who knew? This is a man who invented winning awards. He made stuff up. He lied about every stage of his career. He's involved in malpractice suits. Just an all-around bad character. I'm just wondering how it is that somebody like that manages to attract people from University Hospital of Zurich and Brigham and Women's and Salt Lake, all that stuff. How is this even possible that these people didn't smell a rat? I do not know. So at any rate, they said, based on this development, we can no longer vouch for the veracity of the primary data sources. That's really polite, but what they really ought to be saying is this data was fraudulent and shot through with fraud through and through. So it was retracted, but not before the damage was done, of course. And as we tweeted a while back, James Todaro here said, it had been 10 days, and this was back on June 1st. So today being June 4th, add 3 days to that. 13 days it took Lancet to retract this particular study. And that was totally unacceptable. And damage is done. Damage is done to the Lancet, to science, to people's trust and faith in science. This wasn't a preprint. This made it into one of the premier medical journals in the world. It should never have even remotely made it through any sort of a peer review process. But within days of it being published, the Lancet shouldn't have waited for the authors to retract it. They should have waited. They should have retracted it all on their own. I mean, they put out that statement of clarification. You know, like, oh, we're you know, anyway, Lancet, black eye, huge black eye on that thing. But I told you it had some other alarm bells go off. And remember, we talked about the usefulness of ivermectin. I saw this name, Amit Patel, and I remembered seeing this. That's one of the names that shows up down here, right here. Amit Patel. I was like, oh, no. So then I went digging back down deeper into this and discovered another name in here, Sapan Desai right here from Surgisphere. And the authors purport to have reviewed over 68,000 patient records from 169 hospitals around the world. Oh, no, this is another thing. So I hate to tell you this, Amit, you got another retraction coming your way. David Grainer, you got a retraction coming your way. And Mandeep, oh, there you are again. You have a retraction coming your way. Whoa, Mandeep, you are not hitting out of the park this cycle of your career. Oh, my God, this is awful. You're going to have multiple retractions to your name. Very embarrassing. All right, let's go on to much better science. And by the way, that was from May 14th, so I am hereby retracting the statement that ivermectin works. We have no data on it at this point in time. I thought this was going to be, it was an interesting idea, and I'm embarrassed that we have to retract this too. So, but again, this was in a peer-reviewed journal, so science taking another black eye, just awful. It shows you the amount of damage a single fraudster can actually commit and conduct, but not without willing help. Not without a fraudster is no good all by themselves. They need willing participants to go along with that. Our media fell for all of this stuff. These other researchers fell for it. And even I guess I fell for it because I was following the science as I thought it was being conducted. This is an unusual level of fraud that goes on right here, but maybe not surprising. Maybe Sapan Desai just looked at what happened with Theranos. And that company that made up all the data about, I mean, $1 billion company. It had like Henry Kissinger on the board, all these power hitters and everything, all around that woman, Elizabeth Holmes, who was just making stuff up, just literally making up data and running basically a scam. And by the way, the first thing you have to ask yourself is how many other scams are out there running right now, right? How many vaccine so-called trials are actually scams? How much of science is shot through as scams? And by the way, how does a culture get to the point where this is okay enough that enough people are doing it and that it can even escape into the public sphere, but not caught, like the system doesn't have appropriate checks and balances? At any rate, let's move on to much better science. Akash Desai, and I tweeted back to Akash and I said, I just got to ask, any relation to this Desai? And I honestly don't know. I'm not being flippant. I just wanted to know. Didn't receive any response to that. So I don't know. I don't think so, but I'm not. Who knows? Right. Data should be out soon. This should provide unequivocal evidence against use of prophylaxis with hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19. And huge news in a large randomized controlled trial done by the excellent Boulware doctor and team. That Dr. Boulware is the lead author on this. Hydroxychloroquine was no more effective than a placebo in preventing COVID-19 after exposure. Full study with details, blah, blah. Great work. And Washington Post. All right, let's take a look at this study. And here it is in the news. And so I just want to show you how this was actually characterized in the news. So hydroxychloroquine fails trial as a preventative measure against COVID-19. Okay, drug performed no better than placebo. And it says here, a study suggests that use of malaria drug hydroxychloroquine to ward off, not of, COVID-19 in people exposed to infection is futile, as the drug performed no better than placebo when used this way. The trial conducted more than 800 patients in the U.S. and Canada, which has just been published in the NEJM here, recruited people who were at moderate to high risk of contracting COVID-19 because they'd been in close contact with someone with the infection. The subjects, mainly healthcare workers, first responders, and people living with infected individuals, were given either HCQ for 5 days as a post-exposure prophylaxis, that's PEP, or placebo. After 2 weeks, 12% of the people taking the drug had an infection compared to 14% of the placebo group. A few more in the placebo group, but nothing to write home about. And so the take-home message for the general public is that if you're exposed to someone with COVID-19, HCQ is not an effective post-exposure preventative therapy, said lead author David Boulware. I'm not sure this is a message for the general public. This really ought to be science that can be used by doctors. So I would hope that the take-home message for doctors would be that you've given us something, David, that's useful here for doctors to actually figure out if they can use it or not. All right, here's the actual study here, a randomized trial of HCQ as PEP, post-exposure prophylaxis for COVID-19. And so here's what I like. What do I like about this thing? It was randomized. I love it. Double-blind, even better. Placebo-controlled. There it is. RCT. Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. So this is good. I actually like this. I like how they set this up from that standpoint. So, and they enrolled adults who had household or occupational exposure to someone with confirmed COVID-19 at a distance of less than 6 feet for more than 10 minutes while wearing neither a face mask nor an eye shield. That puts them at high risk of exposure. Or while wearing a face mask but no eye shield, which is a moderate risk exposure. Depending on your face shield, that's actually lower than moderate, and some depending on how this was done, but and how the exposure was conducted. Within 4 days after exposure, we randomly assigned participants to receive either placebo or HCQ 800 milligram once, followed by 600 milligram in 6 to 8 hours, and then 600 milligrams daily for 4 additional days. I should note this is a much higher dose than normal. This would normally be conducted at a couple hundred milligrams less than that. So that's actually a pretty hefty dose. So I would expect some side effects from doses that high, and indeed they found those. By the way, this whole idea of within 4 days after exposure, remember when we talked about Tamiflu and other things like that, if you're really trying to look at post-exposure prophylaxis meaning you're going to prevent this from happening, what you really want is you want this in there as early as possible. If you gave Tamiflu 4 days after exposure, the makers of it would tell you it doesn't work. It's really, you want to give it within 48 hours, but the sooner the better. So the 4 days is a little long. I wish they had tightened that up. I think if you really want to do a post-exposure prophylaxis, so again, what they're looking for is, did it prevent the disease or not? It's not really looking for, is it going to limit the duration of it? They didn't do any follow-ups to find out, how long people were sick for and stuff like that. It was just really yes, no. Did you get it or not? They tried to do, I'll show you. They tried to do some scoring of the severity, but it was really not. There's nothing we can conclude from this. Not from a doctor standpoint, not even from a household standpoint. All right. The primary outcome was the incidence of either laboratory-confirmed COVID-19 or illness compatible with COVID-19 within 14 days. Illness compatible with. So they weren't actually laboratory confirming all of these. In fact, they were laboratory confirming very few of them. So here's the study. 821 asymptomatic participants, overall 87.6% of the participants, that's 719 of 821, reported a high-risk exposure to a confirmed COVID-19 contact. The incidence of new illness compatible with COVID-19 did not differ significantly between participants receiving HCQ and those receiving placebo. So 49 of 414 who received HCQ got sick, 58 of 407 who received placebo got sick. So 14.3 to 11.8. Well, it's not nothing. More of these people did get sick, but it wasn't a statistically significantly more. All right. The absolute difference was minus 2.4 percentage points. But look at this confidence interval. It could have been anywhere from minus 7 to 2.2. So that's a really wide confidence interval. It tells me that this study was a little bit underpowered. It would have helped to have more patients, but that's fine. We'll take it. You can't always get the power in the tests you want, but this is a really wide confidence interval because it could have been 95% sure that the actual number wasn't a 2.4% difference. It could have been 7. Or 2.2 in the other direction. That's how wide that confidence interval is. It goes right across zero, safely. Powers right across zero. Side effects were more common with HCQ than placebo, so 40.1 versus 16.8. Yep, pretty high difference there in side effects. That's very statistically significant. But no serious adverse reactions were reported. Yeah, not surprised, because this was complete BS. And so, of course, HCQ is a very, very safe study. So let's look at this NEJM study a little bit more closely here. First, here are the hydroxychloroquine patients, 414 of them, compared to placebo, 407. How many completed the entire 14 days? Well, that was this many total. And look how tight those are, 87.9 to 88.7, almost identical numbers completed. They lost 11% to follow-up and 10.3%, very tight. They got lucky that it was that tight, because it would really messed up their analyses if this was like 6% and that was 19% or something. So really tight. Withdrawal of consent was identical, 1% in both cases. Nobody died. These are really tight right here. And of those who were lost to follow-up, it adds up to 46 here and 42 here. So these are all the reasons that they lost some. No survey data. They didn't know the status. They tried to figure out stuff. But anyway, they lost people from the study. I don't know. That doesn't look like an unusual number. It's just really interesting that it's such a tight range there. When we look at the demographics of the people who were enrolled in this, 414 here, 407 there, really tight ranges again. Average age here was 41, and here it was 40. Sometimes when you do randomized trials, you don't get so lucky that things end up so evenly matched. So they must have been drawing from a really stable patient set, I would imagine. The age range is really tight in there. And the weights were really tight as well, 165 to 168 on average. The biological sex here, male, 46 to 48, 52 to 50. And ethnicities, really pretty tight. White or Caucasian, 59 to 64. Black or African American, 4.6 to 4.4, 22.2 to 20.4 for Asian. Very tight, really tight distributions here. So the demographics are pretty evenly matched. Look at this, 3.6% are smokers versus 2.9, very tight. What I really wanted to get to was when you look down at these chronic health conditions, because these might really matter, and almost identical again, 12.3% showing up with high blood pressure versus 11.8, which is statistically way below the average numbers. So this is a very healthy cohort of people they were drawing upon. And when you look at this, here's where it sort of sums out of all these things you could have. And by the way, kind of interesting that they didn't mention, let me see if I missed it. Did I miss it? No. So what I don't see here is being overweight. So obesity is actually a really strong thing to look for in terms of disease severity and progression. I don't know if it would have any impact on whether or not you catch the disease, but it certainly has a big impact on the disease progression. But look at this. None. People reporting none of any of these sort of chronic health conditions was 73.9 versus 71.3. That's a very healthy patient cohort there, given that the incidence of hypertension in United States is, hypertension alone is something like 35, 40%, something like that, just on that one condition alone. So anyway, very, very healthy group. All right, so when we look at how they set this whole thing up, I'm going to turn now to counterpoints that were provided by Myron Cohen, also in the New England Journal of Medicine. Here's the link down here. And here's what Myron wrote. He wrote, Boulware et al., the author list there, now report in the journal the results of a randomized trial testing HCQ as post-exposure prophylaxis for COVID. This is described by the investigators as a pragmatic trial in which participants were recruited through social media, and almost all data were reported by the participants. Almost all data were reported by the participants. And how did they do that? Well, these guys set up a website and people self-reported symptoms and how they were feeling and whether or not they were taking the drug. So normally in a controlled trial, one of the controls you like to have for sure is that you want to, and different use of the word here, but you want to make sure that you know that the patients are being compliant with the medicine that's being administered. And you would want to also actually be measuring things like, I don't know, temperature, various symptoms, running tests, doing all of that. None of that happened here. This is all self-reported through a website. Not saying that's necessarily a deal killer, but it's not ideal. It's good. I think this is a good study, but a great study wouldn't have data entirely reported by participants. Adults who described a high risk or moderate risk exposure to someone with COVID-19 in their household or an occupational setting were provided with HCQ or placebo by mail within 4 days after the reported exposure, and before symptoms would be expected to develop or present. The authors enrolled 821 participants, and illness that was considered to be consistent with COVID-19 developed in 107 participants, but was confirmed by polymerase chain reaction assay in less than 3% of the participants. So when they said up here, either laboratory confirmed COVID-19 or an illness compatible with COVID-19, what they really meant to say was almost nobody, actually. 3%, just 3% having a PCR assay. Almost nobody was actually tested for COVID. So what happened? Well, the incidence of a new illness compatible with COVID-19 did not differ significantly between participants receiving HCQ and those receiving placebo. Although participant-reported side effects were significantly more common in those receiving HCQ than in those receiving placebo, no serious adverse reactions were reported. So if people didn't have a PCR test to say how they got, if they had COVID or not, what did they do? Well, here's what the study did. I pulled this out of the supplementary index, how the COVID patients were identified in this study. Kind of interesting. I understand why they had to do it this way, because at the time they were running this study, a lot of people couldn't get tested, right? So it wasn't even like they skimped on the testing. It's like nobody could get tested. Even, healthcare workers who were high at risk and had a high exposure chance and all that still couldn't find ways to get themselves tested, because that's not what we were doing in the United States. We were on a strict don't test, don't tell policy by the time when this study was being run. So here's what they did. Clinical criteria for reporting in outpatient or telehealth settings, they say at least 2 of the following symptoms. So here's what you need to have. At least two. You have a fever, which, you could have for COVID-19 or for the flu or other things. Chills, ditto. Rigors, ditto. Myalgia, ditto, which is, achy muscles. Headache, you have those for all sorts of reasons. Sore throat, ditto. You could have that for COVID. You could get it for the flu. You could have it for cold. New olfactory and or taste disorders. This is the one I would consider most definitive for COVID. If you have that, I'd be pretty confident to say, yeah, that's, if you lose a sense of taste or smell, not new olfactory or taste disorders, let's be more precise, loss of the sense of taste or smell. That's pretty definitive for COVID, no question. Or, and that's an or, not an and, at least one of the following symptoms: cough, shortness of breath, or difficulty breathing. At least one of the following. Having a cough is the clinical criteria for reporting. Having a cough, a lot of reasons you could have a cough. Shortness of breath is a little bit more definitive for COVID, but not necessarily. And difficulty breathing, a lot of reasons that could happen, but I'll give that a COVID mark. Is a little bit stronger for that. But cough is not really, unless it's a dry cough that's got a very bilateral sort of a nature. But it would be better if you had a CT scan, because those are very definitive, and then you can sort of tell what's going on. Or somebody could have a severe respiratory illness with at least one of the following: CT scan and or ARDS itself. And here's the and. No alternative, more likely diagnosis, like the cold or flu. Okay, kind of interesting. So use in this trial, the above case definition assumes no epidemiologic linking. All trial participants had epidemiologic linkage. Participants meeting the above case definition are classified as probable COVID-19 cases if they had at least 2 of these things, or they had a cough, or some of this stuff. But if you just had a cough, that's it. You fit the criteria, and they said you were probable COVID-19 case. That's what they did. So the epidemiological linkage for criteria for reporting, check this out. Clinically compatible symptoms with one or more of the following exposures in the 14 days before the onset of symptoms. That's close contact with a person diagnosed with COVID, or travel to a residence in an area with sustained ongoing community transmission of SARS-CoV-2, or member of a risk cohort as defined by public health authorities during an outbreak. Let's see. Close contact with a person diagnosed with COVID-19, whereby close contact is defined as being within 6 feet for a period of 10 minutes to 30 minutes or more, depending upon the exposure. In healthcare settings, this may be defined as exposures of greater than a few minutes or more. Data are insufficient to precisely define the duration of exposure that constitutes prolonged exposure and thus a close contact. So this is how they're linking people in. It's a little fuzzy. So these are people who self-identified as high risk because they knew or felt they were within the proximity of somebody who had been diagnosed with COVID-19 or traveled to or was in a risky setting. So these are people who are self-identifying. Continuing with, this is Myron Cohen here. Continuing with Myron's points, though, he says here, this trial has many limitations acknowledged by the investigators, which is good. They did acknowledge these, and I like that. The trial methods did not allow consistent proof of exposure to SARS-CoV-2. So that's what we were just discussing here. This doesn't give you proof of exposure to COVID. That's part one. Or consistent laboratory confirmation that the symptom complex that was reported represented an actual COVID infection. Why? Because, well, they didn't actually test. There was no testing. So as long as you had some of these symptoms and as long as you had, met some of these linkage criteria, you were counted as having been at high risk. And of course, you were self-reporting this kind of stuff here, right? Myron says that's kind of a limitation. Indeed, the specificity of participant-reported COVID symptoms is low. So that's a polite way of saying people often think they have COVID-19, but when you actually test, they usually don't. Right. So that's what the specificity of participant-reported COVID-19 symptoms is low. So it's hard to be certain how many participants in the trial actually had COVID-19. Adherence to the interventions could not be monitored. So they couldn't monitor. Were people actually taking their pills? Were they taking them on time? Did they take all of them? Did they say they took them, but they didn't? So they couldn't monitor any of that stuff. And participants reported less than perfect adherence, more notably in the group receiving hydroxychloroquine. In addition, so what does that mean? That means that the people who were in the group receiving hydroxychloroquine, they were receiving such high doses that they felt ill, and they knew that, and so some of them dropped out, had less than perfect adherence, so they reported even, they said, no, I didn't take that, I stopped taking that pill. I didn't like how it made me feel, so I stopped. So that's a study limitation for sure. And in addition, those enrolled in the trial were younger, median age of 40 years, and had fewer coexisting conditions than persons in whom severe COVID-19 is most likely to develop. So enrollment of higher risk participants might have yielded a different result. So true. I think all we can really say is if you're relatively healthy and young, this result is what happened. We don't know what would happen in a higher risk group. The trial design raises questions about the expected prevention benefits of hydroxychloroquine. Studies of post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP, are intended to provide an intervention in the shortest possible time to prevent infection. So yes, this is a very good point being made here. In small animal model of SARS-CoV-2 infection, prevention of infection or more severe disease was observed only when the experimental antiviral agent was given before or shortly after exposure. Before or shortly after exposure. In the current trial, In the current trial, the long delay between perceived exposure to SARS-CoV-2 and the initiation of HCQ, over 3 days in most participants, suggests that what was being assessed was prevention of symptoms or progression of COVID-19 rather than prevention of SARS-CoV-2 infection. This is a very, very, very important point here, because what you look even at the statement by the author up here, and where was it? Yeah, it's way back up here. The take-home message for the general public is that if you're exposed to someone with COVID-19, HCQ is not an effective post-exposure prevention therapy. Well, you know what I'd really need to see is I would need to see what would happen for the people who were in this study. First, you got to test for COVID just to be sure. And you got to know that they actually had COVID exposure to be sure. And then you would want to get them this compound either before or shortly after exposure. What's shortly after? Within 48 hours. If most of the people took this stuff after 3 days or more for most participants, then guess what? This is they might have conducted the study as well as they possibly could. People are self-identifying on a website. They're contacted by a researcher. They overnight them some drugs. Hopefully they start taking them on time. They self-report all of their symptomology, and that's what this study was about. But I think they did the best they could, but it's a true study limitation that if you're trying to examine post-exposure prophylaxis, you know what you got to do? You got to get it to them as soon as possible. And over 3 days might not be soon enough to make really declarative statements like this one that David's making here, which is the take-home. Switch, please. This message right here. I don't think you can say that one given this limitation right here. Okay, and what was interesting too was this is from the supplementary stuff as well. I don't need this down here anymore. I was going to make a point about that, but no, I'm not. So they had final classification. They said definitely. We had 14 here that were probable, 14 possible, 1 not compatible, 1 with no symptoms. This is adjudicated clinical case classification. So they had 54 out of N of 54 a cough. 48 had a cough or shortness of breath, right? So remember, all you need is one of those, which was here. If you have cough, shortness of breath, or difficulty breathing, all you need is one of those, and ding, they said, yes, you have COVID. So they had 54 of those that fit into that category there. Probable cases, they had 34 out of the total had 2 or more symptoms of fever, chills, rigors, myalgia, headache, sore throat, all that stuff, right? And 17 with compatible symptoms and an epidemiologic link, which was sore throat, anosmia, myalgia, fever, nasals, blah, 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 all that stuff that can happen, right? And then they had 11, which they said were not compatible as COVID-19 cases. That's the 11 right there. So this was out of both groups, both HCQ and not. There were this many people who were said to have probable or possible COVID-19. And this is how they scored them. And it was just by symptoms. So again, no PCR test, just the symptoms. So what are the other things that could be? Well, you could have a cold, or you could have the flu, or who knows, asthma, I suppose, could give you a shortness of breath sense or something like that. So kind of little weak on that stuff as far as I'm concerned. And so let's see. Yeah, I'm going to go to this first. Let me move this up. All right, here's my summary of this study right now. The good. What do I got? There's good stuff in here. What did I really like? I liked that it was randomized and controlled. That's awesome. I liked that they got the HCQ as early as they could. I think they did the best they could with the situation at the time. So that the fact that they didn't have PCR testing, it's a ding on the study now, but at the time, I don't know that they could have done any more than they actually did. What's the not so good? Well, they didn't test, so who knows, right? People who were self-reporting either had COVID-19, or a cold, or the flu. We don't know. It's actually a very small sample size. They actually had a part in there where they talked about zinc, and they said it doesn't look like zinc works, but they couldn't say anything definitive about the zinc because they didn't mention or couldn't control for or didn't know what form of zinc people were taking, how much they were taking, how often they were taking it. None of that stuff. I think there was just simple yes, no. Did you take zinc as a supplement? And some people said yes. A lot of people said no. They tried to sift through that to see if they could find any benefit. They said, they couldn't really find anything, but there's nothing definitive that can be said about that because it wasn't administered as part of the study. And then, not so good, the self-reporting of symptoms on a website, right? No study doctors were seen. People would write stuff down. They would click radio buttons on the website. There was a little field for them to fill in things like, oh yeah, my hair hurt and I had, runny nose, or whatever they were writing in. And then a group of doctors, and this is the good part, were blinded. They didn't know who was in the HCQ or the placebo group. Didn't know. And by the way, placebo's kind of odd in this one because they actually gave folate, a B vitamin, as the placebo. And folate actually, other studies say, B vitamins actually have an impact on COVID. So at any rate, kind of a weird control. But at any rate, with that said, the doctors would look down at all of the self-reported symptoms and then would score them and say, yeah, probable COVID-19, probably not, right? And they did that in a blinded way. All right. So I think there's some good stuff in here. I think there's some not so good stuff. But when we get back to this, it's certainly not definitive. And so that word, Akash, it does not mean what you think it means. Unequivocal evidence against use. Unequivocal means leaving no doubt, unambiguous. There's unmistakable, indisputable, incontrovertible, right? Those would be the things that would go along with a really, really solid study. I think there's a lot that could be done to beef this study up. And of course, every study could always benefit from more people, more time, more money, more patients, all sorts of things. But we got what we got, and I think this is data that we can use. I still have some questions, and these would be my biggest ones here. I got some questions. All right, but let's look at a PEP study is post-exposure prophylaxis. We're going to look now at what India found around what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis. But to get there, the first thing we have to understand something called an odds ratio. What is an odds ratio? An odds ratio, or OR, is a measure of association between an exposure and an outcome. The OR represents the odds that an outcome will occur given a particular exposure compared to the odds of the outcome occurring in the absence of that exposure. Okay, so when's it used? Odds ratios are used to compare the relative odds of the occurrence of the outcome of interest. So a disease or disorder, in this case COVID-19, given exposure to the variable of interest. So, were you around people with COVID or not? And if you were taking hydroxychloroquine or not, that would be the variables of interest here. So here's the punchline. If the odds ratio equals 1, then the exposure did not affect anything. It was neutral. If the odds ratio is greater than 1, the exposure was associated with higher odds of the outcome. If the odds ratio was less than 1, the exposure was associated with lower odds of an outcome. So that's what we know about the odds ratio. And an adjusted odds ratio then is controls for other predictor variables in a model. So if you have lots of things going on, you have to adjust the odds ratio. So that's what an AOR is. And so now that we have what an adjusted odds ratio is, we can actually maybe understand this just a little bit better, what's being written here. So this is a big study that came out of India recently, and this is on healthcare workers and SARS-CoV-2 infection. India, case control investigation in the time of COVID-19. So what did they do here? A case control design was adopted, and participants were randomly drawn from the countrywide COVID-19 testing data portal maintained by the ICMR. That's the Indian CDC equivalent, I think. Something that's a big medical body there. The test results and contact details of healthcare workers diagnosed as positive cases or negative controls for SARS-CoV-2 using real-time reverse PCR data were available from this database. A 20-item brief questionnaire elicited information on place of work, procedures conducted, and use of PPE. Results. Compared to controls, cases were slightly older, 34.7 versus 33.5. It's pretty close in age, and had more males, 58 versus 50%. In multivariate analyses, healthcare workers performing endotracheal intubation had higher odds of being SARS-CoV-2 infected with an adjusted odds ratio of 4.33. So that's they have a 433% greater chance because it's over 1. So they have healthcare workers performing these endotracheal intubations had a really massively high AOR, meaning they were just coming down with this thing, COVID, pretty strongly. Consumption of 4 more maintenance doses of HCQ was associated with a significant decline in the odds of getting infected with an AOR of 0.44, so that's less than 1. Remember, under 1, exposure associated with lower odds of an outcome. So if you had HCQ in your body, just a 0.4, less than 1 chance, and if you didn't, massively higher chance. And a dose-response relationship existed between frequency of exposure to HCQ and such reductions. And a p-value of less than 0.001, highly statistically significant. So they found a dose response in this thing, and they found a really strong preventative characteristic to this. But this is in pre-exposure prophylaxis, so these people have HCQ in their system before they get exposed. And again, even with post-exposure, you need that in there as soon as possible. So this is actually building a very strong case that you would want to have if you're in a place with COVID or you're at high risk, and this would make a strong case based on this Indian data that you would actually want to be taking HCQ that would help prevent you from getting infection at all. So this is a PREP, so it's not quite India found exactly otherwise. So this is in what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis, PrEP. But that's really big. That's a big giant difference from 4.33 compared to 0.44. That's a huge difference in this study. So those are two big findings right there. All right. And as well, we found that HCQ was Lebanon reported very recently here. This is a preprint, so again, it hasn't been peer-reviewed, so take this with a grain of salt. That's what we're doing these days. And here they said they shared their experience in COVID-19 pneumonia management at St. George Hospital, University Medical Center in Lebanon. In the absence of a standard of care, early diagnosis and opt-in therapy with HCQ and azithromycin, there's the plus azithromycin, were offered. I cut out a bunch of stuff from this intro here and got to the conclusion. Viral dynamics matter in COVID-19 pneumonia, so that was part of their methods. They said, the higher the viral load, the worse the disease outcome. That's more data, which is confirming what we already suspected and knew from other studies, but it's true. The higher your viral loads, the worse off you're going to be. And early control of replication may be crucial in averting complications. Yep, that's a good conclusion to draw. Early administration of HCQ Plus potentially explains our 94.7% success rate in treating fairly complex cohort of COVID-19 pneumonia. All right. So yeah, it looks like Lebanon is confirming with that as well. So where are we with HCQ? Here's where we are. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, the PrEP. You got to administer that, hope preferably for several weeks before COVID exposure. India says, hey, it works. Post-exposure prophylaxis, that's what the NEJM study just was. I think it needs a definitive study with actual lab testing just to be absolutely sure. And but so we've got this study to suggest it doesn't prevent illness from taking hold, but now we don't know anything about once the illness is taken hold, does having that HCQ in your system lead to a much better outcome? They had some loose data around that in this study, the NEJM study. They said they didn't notice any difference, but I got to confess, the way they went out about collecting that data was far from definitive. Okay, so I'm going to just hold off judgment on that at the moment. But still, good study. I liked how it was designed, and I think they did the best they could given the limitations of the times, but we could definitely get better data than that. Symptom and disease severity reduction, that's another way you might use HCQ, and this needs to be administered as early as possible with zinc. And I'm still assuming and azithromycin, right? That's all of that. This study, that hasn't been completed or done yet. And there's no good reason why. Here we are in June, 6 months into this whole thing, and we still don't have that data. That's just crazy time. All right, very quickly, the movement, the all of the things that are happening with the explosion of social unrest out there, I want to put my stamp on that and talk about how I see this. Once again, here we are today. It's at 5:47 right now in the afternoon on June 4th. And this is how, once again, the Dow is green on the day, but it took a 100-point blast in the last 10 minutes to get it there. Look at this. Wow. Right? Somebody comes in and creates and paints these gigantic V shapes day after day. If anytime the market's starting to sell off, somehow magically you get these instant reversals like this, and it took 100 points in the last 10 minutes, this big brrr, to get the Dow green on the day. Not a lot, but then they write all the headlines about investors, this and that. Come on, this is junk. This stock market has nothing to do with reality anymore. This is literally the Federal Reserve picking the already wealthy as the big winners. Here's the S&P at the close of today. It's worth way more than it was a year ago. Look at it compared to a June a year ago. It's worth a lot more. How is the stock market worth more than a year ago? 40 plus million people out of work. Probably a 40% decline in second quarter GDP. Company income statements just ruined left and right, and somehow stocks are worth a lot more. Not just a lot more, but a lot more. This is the highest valuation we've ever seen for stocks. Stocks are now worth, this is Wilshire 5000, so it's a universe of 5,000 stocks. Look at that. Worth more than the bubble in 2000. Worth way more than the bubble that we had in 2007, right? Way higher. This is as high as they've ever been. So on what basis could we say stocks are worth more? Well, there's no basis. It's Federal Reserve printing money and throwing it into the stock market. And if you want to see that handiwork up close and personal, let's look at the Russell 2000. It looks like this. This is the Federal Reserve's handiwork. We have two things here. We have here the price earnings, okay, of the Russell 2000. So that's the relative forward price earnings versus Federal Reserve assets in red. Here's where the Federal Reserve started printing like crazy. And look at this. What happened to stocks next? That's all it wrote. So who owns stocks? The wealthy. And the Federal Reserve is also busy buying mortgage-backed securities. And a lot of people not paying their mortgages. So those securities ought to be tanking, but they're not. You know why? Because there's this permanent bid by the Federal Reserve bailing out the people who bought those mortgage-backed securities and should be losing money because guess what? If you invest, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's called risk. But the Federal Reserve has eliminated all risk for the ultra-wealthy because they have the reasons. If you talk to, oh my God, it's painful talking to these people. They say things like, well, we have to assure smooth, orderly markets, and we have to make sure that we have smooth functioning credit markets. They have all this language, but if you peel away the gobbledygook, it boils down to this. The Federal Reserve is bailing out rich, well-connected investors, assuring that they take no losses. In fact, many of them are making fat gains on their investments. Meanwhile, 50% of the country has no exposure to any of these things that the Federal Reserve is buying. So the Federal Reserve picks winners. They pick losers in this story, right? Everybody who is getting 0% on any money they have in a bank has already been picked as a loser by the Federal Reserve, who's mandated that we should have 0% interest rates. It's not what the market decided. So when the Federal Reserve does that, picks winners and losers, well, first off, that's a really low integrity sort of a thing to do. They've got this ideological rigidity down here about who they are and what they need to do, and they don't understand that there's cause and effect in these things, and everything's connected to everything else. So when you create a massive wealth inequality because you're picking the already wealthy to be the winners of your magic printing press, it's unfair. It's unjust. If you saw the little video I put up on the capuchin monkeys, we don't like unfairness. You feed grapes to one monkey and cucumbers to the other monkey. We don't like that, us cucumber eaters down here. So the Federal Reserve lacks all integrity because they're hiding behind their models and their little stories and rationalizations. But the truth is they're picking winners and losers. And by doing that, it creates a lot of social inequity. And now, is the Fed itself the only cause for all the social unrest we're seeing? No, of course not. There are a lot of reasons. So, a little graphic I made up here. I saw someone else made this, but I wanted to put my own list down here. So you got George Floyd. That's the tip of the iceberg. What do we have? We have no accountability. No accountability for the powerful in particular, right? We've got a really unfair wealth distribution, and that's the Federal Reserve picking the winners and losers, but ultimately creating this massive wealth inequality. We got corporate rackets like sick care, militarized police and tactics, just too many of those to count. Really disturbing images of police just opening fire at people's heads and faces. When they say, oh, someone was hit in the eye with a rubber bullet, and it sounds like there's just a random crowd of people and the police are sort of lazily not aiming and just pushing rubber bullets downrange, and unluckily somebody's eye came in contact with one of those. No, you should ask yourself why so many people get shot in the eye. But if you held one of these police rubber bullet weapons, they have usually a red dot sight on top, sometimes an EOTech 512, very, very, very nice little holographic display thing, which aims very, very precisely. And these rubber bullets are fired out of weapons with rifled barrels, meaning they're highly accurate, meaning that from 50 feet away, if the policeman is aiming for your eye, you're probably going to hit you in the eye, right? So they are actually aiming for the eyes, and people need to know that. That's a militarized police. When a police person is trying to use a so-called rubber bullet for crowd control, but is aiming to maim somebody by taking their eye out, that's not protecting and serving. That's something entirely different there, right? You got civil asset forfeiture, which is where your money can be declared a criminal, and good luck trying to get that back. You got hyper stagnant wages. You got the government lying about all kinds of things like inflation, always saying it's a lot lower than it is. You got the student debt racket going on. We got these zero interest rates, which is really just a way of stealing from everybody who's a saver and giving that benefit back to the banks. You got mega bailouts of Wall Street, and on and on and on and on. This is what all this stuff down here, that's what people are actually really upset about, is that we have a very unfair, very unjust society at this point in time. And so then something like George Floyd comes along and is literally just the spark. So given all of that, if you're younger, you got to take your retirement planning seriously. And so I'm a millennial, this reads, so my retirement plan is societal collapse. I like that nice little needle point. Good use of orange and red. That blends down to yellow. Well done. And if all of this, you find this upsetting, don't worry. You can get yours now. Get your anxiety companion honey badger. They are on order now. Again, thank you, Judy, for that. I love that one. Emotional support animal. This would be a great emotional support animal. All right, conclusions for today. The Lancet paper, hey, it never should have been printed. Never should have been printed. And I'm glad it's retracted, but I'm really irate at all the damage that was done. The NEJM study that we went through, I think it was well done. It's got some significant limitations on balance. And as it stands, I think it credibly reduces the case for HCQ being an effective post-exposure preventative. That's what the data says. And I always go where the data is. I want to see more data. But, and what do I want to see? I want to see that study redone. I want to see it done better. Testing for COVID for sure, but with azithromycin plus zinc. Get that in there, please. All right, India and Lebanon seem to be having some sort of success with HCQ plus, and the Federal Reserve literally doing everything it can to create a class war, and I think it's got one on its hands right now, and I deplore that this really tiny group of unelected bankers get to choose that a less than 1% minority should gain at the expense of everybody else. And again, if you want to hear more about the Fed, come to this link here and watch our What the Fed 2 and watch What the Fed 1 if you want to see the first part of that. So what do you do in the meantime? Get a shirt, get a t-shirt, join a movement, and that'd be a great thing. Plant your garden. Just plant one. And oh boy, these I got to take a picture again. These are all practically covering the dirt now. They've grown so much. And in the meantime, if you are exposed to COVID or you think you might be, make sure that you've got selenium, D3, zinc, and vitamin C all in your system. You definitely want to make sure you've got those in your system. And having things like elderberry syrup here is a great way to, and/or with quercetin are both great ways to make sure that your body is as tuned up as it can be so that if you do get a few virus particles in there, your body fights them off effectively all on its own. All right, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening, and let's hope the country calms down, and I want you to have a great weekend. We'll be back with you next Tuesday. Again, thanks for listening.
Hi, folks. This is Adam Taggart, Chris's co-founder at Peak Prosperity. To get your own resilient shirt, simply go to peakprosperity.com/shirts. Each shirt is made of 100% organic cotton and produced in the USA. And when your shirt arrives, please send us a photo of you wearing it if you feel comfortable doing so. We'll add you to our wall of proud Peak Prosperity members who are showing the world that resilience is the way to a better future. Thanks for watching.